Okay, let's get started. Welcome to today's Harvard Data Science Initiative Industry Seminar. I'm Jen Chow. I'm Director of External Engagement, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Alan Hanley from GE Vernova. Alan is EHS Digital Leader for GE Vernova, which was formed in 2024 from General Electric's energy businesses. Today, its mission is to electrify to thrive and decarbonize. The scale of its operations include 75,000 employees in 100 countries worldwide, making it a leader in the transition to more reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy. Alan has been part of the GE family for over 20 years, where he's helped lead global efforts in environmental health and safety, EHS technology. Today, his focus is on using digital and emerging technologies like AI, machine learning, and virtual reality to support global EHS operations and data analytics. Earlier in his career, Alan worked in GE's corporate environmental programs, managing information systems and business intelligence for remediation and brownfields projects. Across these roles, he's led system integrations, data management, and digital initiatives that support EHS teams operating across more than 150 countries. So before I hand over to Alan, I'd like to remind our audience that there will be time after his presentation for questions. Please do use the Q&A function to send in your questions at any point during the presentation. Don't be shy. All questions are good questions. All right. Thank you and welcome, Alan.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. Great introduction. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here as part of the new member of the industry forum. And so thank you for joining, and hopefully we have a good session today. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Hopefully you all are seeing this. All right. So for EHS data analytics, and as Jennifer said, we, GE Vernova, spun out of the legacy GE business a couple of years ago. So I just want to go into a little bit about our background, just to set the context of our program. We are the energy segment portion of GE, so we have the wind, power, electrification, and our accelerators. So what this means when we think about EHS and our data, as you can see, we're a very diverse portfolio of operations and risk. And in all of these operations, we not only have our employees in our workforce, but we also work alongside with contingent leased workers, as well as contract workers, partners. We think of our project installations in the field and service operations in the field globally, on top of course, our facilities manufacturing plants. So we're dealing with all aspects of risk there, and using our data and innovative technologies to keep that entire workforce safe. So just sharing some information about the company. I think Jennifer did a good job of introing, so I won't go into too much detail here. And this is all directly from our sustainability report that's publicly released each year. So this is all information that can be shared and accessed by any of you. So when we talk about EHS, environment, health, and safety for Vernova, focusing on the safety data, our mission is fatality-free operations. We've had past couple of years, when we look at that entire workforce, 3 to 4 fatalities a year, and that's 3 to 4 too many. Our goal, with our programs, our EHS management systems, the data analytics that we do, and the tools that we implement are all targeted around this fatality-free mission. Send our people home better than they came to work, or at least the same. And really, we're talking now more in terms of the power of care with our workforce and caring for each other, caring for the people next to you, whether they're part of GE Vernova or not, contractor or just somebody on the site. That care extends to everyone, and that's how we protect each other. So when we think about safeguarding the future of our people and our workforce, and of course the company, we want to be enabled by innovation. So we recently formed an AI Robotics and Automation Council, which I'm a part of, representing EHS, along with all the other functions across the enterprise, looking for ways to remove our people from harm. take them out of the line of fire, take them out of what we call the dull, dangerous, and dirty kind of jobs wherever possible. So always trying to enable by innovation, supported by technology. We are trying to use the best in class technology we can. When we think about our systems and whether that's from a vendor, outside vendor, and how we ingest that data and use that for analytics in our own Vernova systems. And we really try to drive all of this with science-based program, right? So we are using that data to identify the risk that then drive our resources to where we want to put them to address those risks. So we're not going on our gut here. We're using data wherever possible to drive those decisions at the business level. And really the foundation of any EHS program is the management system. So this management system has been in place for many years. As Jennifer said, I've been at GE for 23 years now. And when we think about a management system, it incorporates all of these different aspects, including the tools and data insights you see down there in the lower left. But we're talking about, our operational reviews and what we call the EHS framework expectations. That's essentially how we gauge our compliance against our requirements. So when we're setting company level requirements across our businesses, we're using this framework scorecard for us to do self-assessments at our facilities and really across all of our operations globally. The culture and engagement is a huge piece of this. None of this works without without a strong safety culture. And we have an engagement leader that helps us with that, making sure that all the people from the shop floor all the way up to the senior office are fully engaged in safety. And we like to talk about it in a way that, EHS as a function, we should get to the point where we're not really necessary anymore. And it's really the operations teams, the people on the floor, everybody owns safety. We're here to help them along that journey until they get there. But too often you hear that safety is the EHS job. We're here to make sure that it's everybody's job and that we, in your mind, in your heart, in your gut, we all need to be embracing that safety culture. Part of how we do this is through what we call plan, do, check, act, right? We have what we call a read across process. When we have the events, an incident takes place, we treat each one of those incidents, especially the severe or potentially severe events, as a learning opportunity. And we want to immediately read that across our operations such that that doesn't happen again. So if we've identified actions that can prevent that incident from occurring again, we want to look across the enterprise to where we have similar operations, similar risks, similar hazards. And we want to make sure that those sites and those teams are aware of what happened, learn from the event that took place, and implement the same actions that the origin site experienced and implemented. We want to make sure that those actions are assigned, tracked to closure, right? We're using visualization tools and dashboards to make sure that that's transparent, that everyone can follow that along the company. And I think that transparency brings accountability. And then we have the zero repeats. We're checking those actions that we closed out to make sure that they are sustainable and that they are still in place and that they don't perhaps need some additional controls to be more effective. We want that initial action that took place to be effective long term. All right, so that's the check. And then act is you're doing the root cause analysis, right? You're identifying what those actions are. You're doing detailed investigations, and we're striving to all do that in a standardized manner. Again, the learning across the enterprise is really critical there so that we don't see repeat events. And this is really just the concept of, left of boom, right of boom. I think too often the history of EHS has been right of boom, right? So the event takes place, you do your root cause analysis, you do your learnings, you're looking at data, you're looking at historic trends, and you're really not being proactive with your data. And our position is, and I think most companies are trying to get left of boom. And how do you get more preventive, predictive, prescriptive using that data to look ahead? What are we doing when we think of leading versus lagging indicators? And how do we put most of our resources and most of our energy and effort left of boom to prevent that boom? And kind of get out of this mentality of always being reactive and looking back. When we talk about fatality free as a mission, this is not linear, right? I mean, it's going to change. There's a lot of different aspects that impact this mission. And when we think about leadership is one of the keys, right? We're thinking about contractor management, one of our biggest challenges. And there, the data is also not only managing our contractors is the challenge, but accessing the contractor's data is also somewhat of a challenge. We'll talk about these life-saving rules being operationalized in a little bit. I'll get into some more detail on those. And again, we have the read across and different areas here where you can have a great solid program and culture, but things like a holiday can really throw off an entire site or entire team. People trying to rush off to whatever holiday events they have to meet with their families. They're going to rush their work. They're going to cut some corners, perhaps without meaning to. And then we have periods of refocus. And how do we maintain a consistent focus on safety throughout all these changes? And especially with some of our projects, we're on a customer site, we're installing a gas turbine at a power plant, or we're servicing a gas turbine during an outage at that power plant. There's a lot of time constraints, a lot of pressure for us to get the job done on time for the customer. And we need to make sure that we're partnering with those customers and that they're as bought in on the safety front as we are, and that all of our people are considered part of the team. Right? When we think about our safety professionals, we think about you have a low battery. How do we make sure our people are fully charged, fully ready to do the work, fully ready to be there, be present, and able to perform the task? And that starts with leadership, and how are we setting the psychological safety for our people, for them to speak up and tell us they're not ready for the job, or be able to have that conversation that maybe today is not a good day. Maybe they have some things going on in their personal life, and we need to discuss that, right? We need to have that open reporting, a stop work culture where people feel empowered to stop the work regardless of the consequences for cost and time and project timelines, because they see something that's not right, either for them or for the people around them. They need to be able to stop that work immediately. Right, and this communication, as we're promoting that communication, people feel more empowered to do that. They're more energized, they're more bought into the culture, they're now living the culture with us. Right, and you're fully charged, you're ready, you can anticipate and adapt to the changes, you're recognizing the changes in your workspace, you've done a risk assessment before the work, but then when you're starting the work, you're reassessing for the new conditions that might be present on the ground where things may have changed. So these are just some of the rules of safety, leading with the life-saving rules, engaging your people, and ultimately safety is good business. But these are our life-saving rules. When we formed Vernova, Legacy GE had what we called the life-saving principles, and there were 13. So for a couple of reasons, we did a revamp on this right from the beginning of Vernova. One, to reduce it to those life-saving critical risks that we see impacting our operations, resulting in fatalities historically. And we wanted to, obviously we're not in the aviation or healthcare business anymore, so we wanted to refocus on those risks that are specific to our business. And then we really thinking about, people tend to be able to remember 3 things really well, not a list of 10. And especially when you multiply that by 9, you're really, setting an unrealistic expectation with your people that they really embrace these rules when it's hard to remember all the content. So we're trying to really drive it down to what are those critical things that our people need to do before they start the work to ensure that they do not die that day. or that someone on their team doesn't go home that day. These life-saving rules are public. We like to share them, with our contractors. We want to make sure that they're aware of them, that they are embracing them and using them in their programs. We put this out on the gevernova.com website. Anyone can access it. Anyone can use the content. We like to think there's no, IP on safety. So feel free to peruse that on the vernova.com webpage. And that all sets up the foundation for what we want to talk about when we're looking at data and analytics, right? And so when we're setting up, I set up our team at the corporate headquarters, setting the expectations for what we consider to be best-in-class data and analytics. What does that look like? How do we know when we get there? What can we expect? What are the challenges along the way, considering where we're starting from? And we have a pretty robust system in that, we've been doing this since before I started at GE. We've been collecting EHS data. We developed one of the leading systems in this space, Benchmark Gen Suite. That was a tool that was created in-house at GE 25 years ago, and it spun off when we sold one of our plastics business years ago, and they wanted to keep using it. So we spun that off. So essentially, we have data going back 25 years for those business operations that have been with GE that long. And that's just an enormous amount of incident and record data. We have not always been preventive, predictive, prescriptive with that data. We definitely were in a space of looking back, focusing too much on the lagging indicators. I think a lot of EHS programs get hung up on their injury and illness rate, the I&I rate, as it needs to be reported to OSHA. It is a regulatory compliance issue. We certainly have to do it, but I think in years past, most of the focus was, if you're leading a site and operation and your I&I rate went from 3.14 to 3.19, suddenly now you have to answer to leadership for that 0.04 change, and the amount of resources and time and effort that goes into managing that really is not addressing the risk. Like, what was the risk at the site? What's your highest risk is not probably driving your I&I rate when, a lot of recordable injuries might be cuts and scratches and scrapes that required minor medical care. Certainly, unfortunate that they occur, but probably unlikely to result in a fatality. And we need to make sure that we're focusing all of our efforts where those fatalities are most likely to happen. So we're moving away from the I&I rate and looking more towards our leading indicators. Okay, so we want to get predictive and prescriptive. We don't only want to tell people where we think the risk is, but what we think based on the data, what we think they need to do about it. How can we develop a sort of early warning and detection system that says, hey, all the conditions are in place at your operation for a significant event to occur. Here's what we think you should do to make sure that doesn't happen. That's the kind of prescriptive information we need to be able to provide our operations. And having that data culture where everyone understands the data. We recently had a health program around knowing your numbers and how important it is for people to know, on a regular basis, what's your cholesterol, what's your blood pressure, and I like to bring that back to our program, and it's, how informed are you about your data for your operation? Do you understand where your risks are based on the data? What is it telling you? How often are you looking at it? Are you validating it? Are you verifying that it's being entered correctly by your teams? And then are you using it to manage your work, to identify the highest risk? Right? That data reliability is critical. We have, hundreds, not 1,000 more people entering this data when we think about our incident records and how we classify the severity, the likelihood. Are we doing that consistently across the operation so that when we look at a Vernova level, we can identify our enterprise-wide risks all the way down to a site level where we can say in this building, in this department, this is the highest risk here because we're all using the same criteria to gauge that risk and identify where the risk is. based on that severity and likelihood, that we're all doing it the same way. And that we're checking the data, we're validating it. We have regular, auditing protocols, both at the business level and at the corporate level. And looking at this as a cross-functional, again, back to where I started, where, this should not be the sole purview of the EHS department. Operations, HR, everybody needs to be a part of this. Sourcing is critical. If we're using contractor firms that we see having a lot of incidents that aren't responding to those incidents the way that we would like to see, or not working to prevent them, we need to work with sourcing to make sure that we're not using those contractor firms anymore. And so it really does hit all of the different functions if you want to drive the safety culture that we're looking for. And of course, collaboration is huge. I mean, a lot of people think I'm in the IT department, but I'm not. I've been in EHS the entire time, but all along have had really strong partnership, and would definitely not have any success without the partnership with our digital technology team. We call them DT at GE, traditional IT departments, but without their engagement, we couldn't get anywhere. And so really, this is, again, broad cross-functional efforts across the company. And I think transparency we talked about, for years, we did not have dashboards, and that technology really wasn't available for us. And you could have that one site, and only your business leader would know just how bad it was. And there was no way for a site to compare. Say they know a site with similar size in a similar region, maybe slightly different operations. What are they doing, and what do their numbers look like? How can I find what good looks like? And then go talk to those people and figure out what kind of programs they have in place to get to the success point where they are, and how can I implement that at my site? So the transparency from an accountability point of view is critical, but it's also how we learn and how we grow and improve by seeing what good looks like somewhere else and then aiming your operation to meet that. And of course, speed, just, working at the speed of business and being able to pivot and change along the way. And that's, for a large company, often very difficult, and a lot of bureaucracy that sometimes gets in the way of that. But that's something we always have to keep front of mind, is making sure our programs are resilient enough to pivot quickly. And so here I want to just get into some of the projects that we have going on. Won't hit on all of these, but just to give a flavor of where we're applying technology today at Vernova, and really across these 4 pillars of AI, robotics, wearables, and digitalization. Some of this is just starting. Some of it's kind of a proof of concept phase up through full rollout across the enterprise. So we have, and I'll go through these in our Gen Suite tool. We've worked as part of a customer consortium group with Gen Suite to develop certain tools within their platform. And members of our team, myself included, have worked with them on their AI development over the past several years. And some of this is sort of in the helper AI range. Some of it's more in the sort of analyzer. Some of it's more in risk identifying. So there's various tools within Gen Suite that we've built out, and that, well, they've built out for us with our partnership to improve that set of tools. It's not only on the sort of analytics side, but critically on the data entry side, that's helping to improve the quality of our data and as it's being entered, so that we can then utilize those analyzing tools. So we found so many times over the years, we have these great technology, but when you looked at the data set, it was so inconsistent, and bad data in, bad results out, right? So really trying to find different ways to improve the data quality going into the tools to enable us to use those technologies better on the outside. And so we have Gen Suite really for our employee data. Our contractor data for reporting needs, we keep that separate. We're not reporting that to OSHA, but we do report it internally, and we report it externally to our investors, to our board of directors, and other locations, other operations. But we don't want that mixed in with our OSHA data. So we keep that in a separate system that also is accessible to those contractors and that we can engage with them there. And that's ComplyWorks, which is an application by owned by Veriforce. In that tool, or integrated with that tool, we built what we call a CDA, or the Contractor Document Assessment Tool, as a machine learning to analyze their qualification documents against our criteria for requirements for them to perform work for Vernova. As an example, it will score them, review their contracts that they submit into the tool, and score it against whether or not they have the appropriate training for the type of work that they're going to perform, right? Do they have the right kind of programs in place that we expect when you think about de-energizing equipment prior to work? And so we have a long checklist of criteria, and the tool essentially scores this contractor firm against that criteria and lets us know, are we okay to move forward working with this firm or not? We found over the years this had been done manually by multiple different teams across the company. Each business team reviewed their own documents or had multiple teams reviewing their documents independently. And there was a lot of human error, as you can imagine. Some of these documents are quite large. There's a lot of information in there. And what we found was not only were people missing some critical points, but also we're trying to approve a contractor firm for a very specific type of work. We're not going to approve them to just work for Vernova. We're going to approve them for a specific work type. Are they going to be doing live electrical work? Yes. That doesn't necessarily mean they're approved to work on scaffolding and work at height. They would need separate program approval for that. So that AI tool is going through and doing all that for us. And of course, with regular checks and audits, that's one that we recently found stopped working at our transition, our separation from legacy GE, and we had to go back and focus on retraining some of that. And that was really that whole separation process of cloning and copying all of our applications across 3 new businesses. We found out a lot about what we had and what we needed and resources, and that was one of them. So we're getting the CDA tool back up and going because it's so valuable for us. You think about ergonomic evaluations. We're working with companies like Inseer, Zumeki, that do computer vision analysis of people performing work to identify repetitive, high weight, high torque kind of movements, and help us measure those and prevent them or change operations to reduce them. And so that's something that's in development right now that we hope to be fully integratable with our GenSuite platform, such that when we identify any findings, we then log those records in our tools. We can then track those to closure, and then we can learn from them and learn from those trends as we move on. Our Advanced Research Center, we have one in Niskayuna, New York, and one in Bangalore, India. And these have been around for quite a while, and this is really where our brain trust sits, where they're coming up with decarbonization patents, and this is where our main AI team sits. So I'll get into it a little bit later, the detail of our project there, but this early warning detection and notification system that we're working with them to develop, focusing first on our wind business and our wind field operations, to, again, identify those, talking about what are the signals that we are tracking and at what frequency do we, when we see those signals sort of peaking or trending upward, at which point do we pull the trigger and warn that site that, hey, you need to get out and take these specific actions based on what was the rationale for this warning being sent to you, and having that all be driven by our data. Right, and this also looking at ways, more sort of business transformational projects to lean out waste. And we think about one of our biggest challenges enterprise-wide is the collection of hours worked that goes into the calculation of our I&I rate to OSHA. And we think about a company our size, we have many, many different HR systems, different systems in different countries for different, regulatory reasons. But tracking that data and getting accurate numbers for the people in our locations is a challenge that each one of our individual EHS site leaders needs to perform on a regular basis. And that burden across our industry or across the enterprise is high, and the compliance risk is also high. And so if we can develop some agents to go out and collect and gather that information for us and store it directly into our GenSuite system for automated I&I reporting to OSHA, that's going to be a game changer for us. So that's a project we're looking to kick off before the end of this year. Obviously, becoming partners here. Looking forward to great partnership and hopefully some support on some of these projects. We have what we call Safety Oculus, the computer vision program that we're scaling up across the enterprise. We've had it at a few sites where if you have a security camera positioned near, let's say, a crane that's performing regular lifts, routine lifts, that camera is being utilizing computer vision to monitor the exclusion zone around that lift such that it prevents people from putting themselves in the line of fire related to that lift. They're not walking under the load. They're not crossing the exclusion zone where they may get hit by the load. And it's sending out alerts, both audible and into the system again, fully integrated with our GenSuite system to track each one of those incidents that it identifies. We're also looking at, from fork truck safety, not just the speed of the fork truck, which was fairly easy to pick up, but in a more complex use case, we have looking at the segregation of pedestrian traffic and fork truck traffic. In some of our plants, there might be 15, 20 plus fork trucks moving around, and we have both in the facility, but then also out in the yard, moving parts around and equipment, and making sure that we're evaluating those traffic flows in a way that allow us to better manage and segregate the pedestrians from the work truck, and hopefully eliminate some need of those fork trucks by positioning products and operations in a more more aligned with eliminating that, keeping people out of the line of fire. Robotics, this is fairly new. I mentioned the council. I mean, robotics aren't new for us, but the council and taking a more enterprise-wide look at this to eliminate where we have people in the line of fire, whether that's for ergonomic issues or for more significant risk. And a lot of this goes in line with just from a lean approach of quality manufacturing. What's good for the quality of our services and our service teams is also likely going to help from a safety aspect as well. So that's that cross-functional partnership that we look for to say, look, safety is good business. If we can eliminate this risk, it's also going to eliminate waste in the process and get a more simplified, streamlined quality process in the end. So we're looking at a lot of different ways that we can use that for the multi-purpose for robotics. We're thinking about confined space work and just thinking about our wind blades, for instance, in doing inspections on the wind blades or within the wind blades to detect anomalies in the surface and having robotics do that for us. And there's some great examples of where that's being done today. Eyewear in the field is one, and I think especially cameras, and we think about law enforcement and body cams. And I know that there's we're going to be starting to talk with some of those vendors on. I know they're using AI after the fact. They're using AI to analyze those videos. We're looking for the use of that computer vision while you're performing the work. So if you have people out in the field approaching a wind tower, what are the 5 top risks that our workers face in those wind towers, from the electrical panel up to moving their tools up and down tower to working around the turbine, and of course, being up on top of the tower, and how can we train those cameras to pick up and identify risks in those areas while people are performing the work? And how can we use that to stop the work, to alert the person that what they're doing is not a standard operating procedure, it's putting them or somebody else at risk, and that they need to stop and reassess the conditions before they continue. And ideally, have some line of sight for somebody like myself or somebody in a supervisory position offsite to be able to step in and do that for them and say, hey, wait a second, that doesn't look right. Stop. Let's reassess before you start up again. So we have a stop work when it's not safe. You start only when it is safe. You're constantly reassessing those conditions. So that's an area where we're putting a lot of focus. The eyewear piece of that we've tried in the past. It's a little difficult and challenging when you think about the weather conditions our people are facing out in the field. And we've benchmarked this a little bit with oil and gas industry. And the same kind of holds true that, you're out there in the field, a lot of heat, a lot of sweat, and the glasses often get in the way or actually cause an additional risk by falling off while performing the work, or not sitting correctly, or there's different ways that we can address that. Of course, as people wear eyewear playing sports all the time and don't seem to have a problem with it, but that is repeated feedback that we're received regarding the smart eyewear. But we're going to keep pushing in that area. And I think where we're seeing the most sort of homegrown kind of growth is around the digitization of our workflows, our checklists, and people out in the field. I think this is really critical that we have safety processes and checklists in place, but it's how they're being used. If somebody's sitting in a truck and filling out an Excel sheet, closing their laptop, and then they're not even at the job yet, they're not really doing that full assessment, and we don't know. And so connectivity issues are definitely, at the forefront here. But if we can digitize these processes and make sure that we have workflows in place for the high risk operations that we perform, we can step in and say, stop, you're not qualified to do the work. You don't have the right safety gear on. Any number of things, having those steps in the approval process and knowing that the technician is where they're supposed to be to start that assessment, using beacons, RFID tags, QR codes, whatever it might be, to geolocate the person with a timestamp of where they are. You're driving that accountability with your workforce, and you're getting better data as a result. We have some mobile access. One of our biggest challenges, I would say, is getting our contractors access to our systems. And then with the dual systems, training and educating our workforce to know where to put certain data points, right? And what ultimately we need to get to is that really, system agnostic user interface where the users are going one place, it's action oriented, they know what they need to do, they don't really care which system it goes to or what we're calling that data point. They just know, I'm going to log a safety concern, and I'm a contractor, then it goes here, right? And it gets routed to where it needs to go. So we're putting a lot of effort into simplifying that user experience to drive engagement, and also just improve data quality overall. Simple forklift authorizations. How do we know that people are authorized to drive that specific type of fork truck? And simple card swipe, kind of identifying, do you have the training? We're seeing, I was just at a site in China that's rolling out a fingerprint start process where you put your thumbprint right on the starter, and if your record does not have you authorized with the current training authorization, that vehicle will not start. And so similarly with cranes, trying to implement that wherever we need to make sure that only authorized personnel are operating that equipment based on training and other certifications they might need. Tracking that and tying it to a thumbprint is the easiest way to go in a lot of cases. And so that's been really powerful. So a lot of different workflows, I won't get into those, but ultimately comes down to managing how we start work safely and how we know that the people are doing the checklist that allow them to start work safely. When we think about a analytics maturity model, probably seen this with a lot of different areas, maturity models fairly the same, and getting that sort of from foundational, do you even have a system to record your data? Is everyone using the same system consistently? Are you able to trend that data to know what happened? Looking at trends historically, are you able to analyze that to understand why it happened? How are these things continuing to happen again and again? Getting to predictive, where we're sort of getting there now, where we're trying to see what are those conditions. This is something, just to pause here for a second, because I think even predictive, I'm moving away from that and thinking more preventive and prescriptive, because I don't think we're going to get to the point of knowing that a particular employee is going to get a particular injury at a particular location next Wednesday. I don't think we're going to get to that point when you think about the variety and scale of our operations. Perhaps in a different enterprise where you have highly repetitive, highly routine, very similar activities across your business, that could be more possible. But I think in our industry, with our portfolio of operations and just the vast variety of risk that we face, it's going to be really difficult to get that pinpointed on a specific injury happening to a specific person at a specific time. More so, we're trying to look at it from cultural aspects of why do we think, what is causing our fatalities? And if we think about the fatalities that we have had historically, tend to be, the vast majority are somebody operating outside of standard procedures for whatever reason, intentionally or not. They deviated from the standard work practice, and there are certain conditions, we believe, to enable that kind of culture that would make someone more likely to deviate from the standard operations. Maybe they're in a culture that's being pushed, a culture that's not respecting the stop work empowerment of the people on the work floor. Maybe there's not an operation that maybe is not putting enough focus on appropriate training or timely training, or repairing their equipment on time. They're putting their people at risk. Maybe there's leadership issues. So how do we identify those signals that are not incidents? Nothing happened yet, but we're seeing these sort of signals pop up, and we're seeing that frequency increase to where we think once we hit a certain point, you have now such a lack of culture that a severe event is bound to happen, right? And we can look at adjacent data sets to see similar kind of issues. If there's a lot of HR investigations, ombuds reports, do we have a lot of product quality issues at the site? Are there safety issues, product safety issues that are related to the product that's coming out of that site? How do we look broadly across our functions to try to identify those indicators that we think, again, set the environment for a potentially severe event to occur? So we're trying to get this all the way up to, cognitive. We're not there yet, but that's where we hope to be. Getting back to our systems, just to get a little more detail on these. The benchmark Gen Suite, we have roughly 80,000 employees across our workforce, and we expect that every one of them is touching this system at some point, if not only to enter a safety concern. Even in our offices, if somebody sees something in the parking lot, an icy spot in the parking lot, enter a safety concern. But certainly at our manufacturing sites, we want to make sure everyone's empowered to enter concerns and see them closed and have that confidence that they're being heard, that their voice matters, and that they should raise it again the next time they see something, say something. But we need to follow through, and we need to be able to track those to closure and hold our site leadership accountable to do that. We have all of our incidents, and whether injuries or non-injuries, property damage, vehicle accidents, fires, penalties, wastewater exceedances, you name it on the incident front. And then our PSEs are our potentially severe events. So, but for the controls in place, it could have realistically resulted in a fatality in more than one fatality. Those PSEs we use for the learnings. When we're tagged a PSE, even though a severe event did not occur, we treat it as if one did. We do the root cause analysis. We read it across the enterprise to similar operations to make sure everyone's aware of those actions and able to track those actions to closure. We have the stop work is something that we record. When somebody does stop work, we want to know why, and we want to know what the conditions were that caused that and what was the result, what actions were put in place to make sure that when they did start work, they started work safely. This is where our OSHA reports are coming from. We're doing all of our inspections and audits, cross-business audits. There's actually 78 different modules in Gen Suite, all from management of change tools, permit managers, our SDS, safety data sheet management systems. So there's a lot of different tools. These are really the critical foundational pieces that I'm showing here today that really we expect everyone to participate in. And similarly with our contract and partner workforce and in ComplyWorks, we're looking at the same kind of data. And we have over 15, I think I heard yesterday, 15,000 different individual firms out there. And some of those are quite large. If you think of that workforce is enormous. And those people are often temporary, working for us for a little while, then working for our customer, for our competitors, and coming back. And so a much more difficult workforce to build that kind of culture with. We're starting with those life-saving rules that I shared earlier. We think they're buying into that part of it. That gets us sort of on the same team, right? And the more we can share, the more we can get them, involved with our training and our programs, and get that into their hearts and heads and stomachs. That we are one workforce, and we should treat each other that way. Because they do represent about 80% of our fatalities, unfortunately. When we see this, part of this, you see 9% of stop work events, our contractors are not typically the ones to stop the work. That's a cultural shift that we need to make. It's also a data point that's very tough to get because it's not necessarily going into our system when it does occur, but it's also a cultural issue of making sure that those contractors are as empowered to speak up and stop work as our employees are. And this is sort of the ecosystem of our data systems for EHS across the company. I was a biology major and studied ecology, so I think of this from a systems approach and how all of these things are related, and how each one of them drives something else downstream. We have a lot of different integrations between the benchmark tool and our ComplyWorks tool, both coming into a central data lake, data repository where we have our data visualization tools, currently Tableau, but moving towards Power BI shortly. Started years ago with Spotfire, and that's sort of democratizing and the transparency of our data and making sure that everyone in the company can see this and can see your site's performance versus another site's performance, not down to the level of the record where we have potentially personal information in those records. That's in the system behind very strong permissions, but the number roll up and the trending and the visualization and of all that's what we try to be as transparent as possible internally, with making sure our teams are both held accountable, but can also learn from similar operations elsewhere in the enterprise. And you'll see that, all of these different integrations allow for, our Workday HR data is flowing directly into Gen Suite. The site structure we have in Gen Suite is flowing through our data lake into ComplyWorks. ComplyWorks has that CDA contractor assessment tool. All of this one change in benchmark digital site structure because we maybe acquired a new business or we sold a business or we just had a organizational structure change. We can make it once there and it flows through to all the other downstream systems because of the master data management integrations that we have set up there. Here we think about leading, and mentioned this before, leading and lagging indicators. And these are a few, but the sort of traditional lagging indicators are the I&I rate. That's probably the most well-known. The incident severity from whether it was first aid to a fatality, tracking those trends, days away from work, can be used to determine how severe something might have been. And people put a lot of focus on the days away from work rate as opposed to the I&I rate, because that days away from work rate will shed some light on how severe that I&I rate is. Is it just a lot of small injuries, or are there a lot of injuries that are long-term, requiring people to stay off the job for a long time? So there's a good reason why you'd look at both of those, but they're both lagging. Things have already happened, and there's not much you can do using that data to look forward. Same thing with workers' compensation. Used to do a lot with that to make the business case of, hey, look, we're going to change this process because we're seeing a lot of back injuries. And typically, a back injury is going to cost the company X number of dollars. We've had 10 over the past year. This project only costs Y number of dollars. Let's make the investment, and that information is useful for certain things, but from a safety culture looking forward, it's not helpful. So what we look at for leading indicators to be proactive and preventive, that learning around potentially severe events, the read across process. The one way we would measure that, and that we do to hold our teams accountable, is if you do have a read across event, you have certain actions that have been assigned to your operation. You need to close those actions out in a certain time period. And if even before that, you need to review the investigation around that potentially severe event with your senior leadership team. What are the learnings that you've gained from that event? Root cause analysis process. What are the actions that you're going to put in place? And then we're going to track those to closure. And if you're meeting our expectations on that process of those learnings from a potentially severe event that actually didn't occur, we're building that culture of learning to get ahead of the event from occurring next time. Similarly, with near miss reporting, we have people that means you're engaged and you're aware that something could have happened. You're aware that it's going to be useful to track that information so that others can learn from it, and so that we can, again, set those actions in place that prevent something from actually occurring. I think the read across has been our most successful rollout over the past few years. That really coming from a quality perspective and a lean mentality of read across that we're seeing across multiple functions, but we're seeing it very effectively applied in our businesses for EHS. We think about other leading indicators like training assignment and completion. Are you really getting ahead of making sure that the right people are getting assigned the right training, and that we're staying on track with that we're getting good quality training and our people are prepared to do the work. That program performance, I mentioned before, our framework is part of the EHS management system. And this is one that we look at sometimes from a cultural perspective. A site might go out and score their operations, let's say 80% on track, compliant with our expectations, that they have all the right tools and programs in place to be compliant with both regulatory obligations and our company's expectations. But then when you look at their other data, maybe they're not showing a very highly engaged workforce. We're not seeing the same number of concern reports logged that another site might have, or stop works or near misses, those things that really can be used to gauge employee engagement on the floor. And so you think you have a great program, you think you have all the controls in place, but we're not seeing it in the data. And so when those two things don't line up, that's a red flag to us to say, let's reach out to that site and let's see what's going on. Maybe we go visit. Maybe we need not necessarily an audit, but just a check-in to see if we're seeing the data. If the story that we're seeing from the data is the reality at the site. And if so, then there's a problem that we need to address, right? So some of that stuff, framework is something that they're doing periodically, always sort of gauging and self-auditing themselves. Effectiveness checks and inspections, audits, cross-business audits, looking at finding closure rates. You're having people submit a lot of concerns, but nobody's closing them out. That's not going to last, right? Because that's a clear indication of leadership support, is that if your concerns are going ignored, no one's doing the work to make sure that that concern has been removed. Whatever the risk was that that person identified and recorded is not being addressed in a timely manner, then they start to lose, the site loses credibility. The people stop logging those concerns. They stop caring. They feel like no one's hearing them. They're not going to stop work next time they see something. They're not going to say something next time they see something. And that quickly erodes your culture more than anything else. So that finding closure rate, concern closure rates, and then engagement, leadership engagement, and how do we track our leaders walking the shop floor and the actions that they take while walking the shop floor or out in the field at an operation, installation, or service operation. If we can track and gauge the level of leadership engagement, that's something that we can use to predict that high engagement from leadership tends to flow down to better safety culture. And the 0 to 0, like I said, we had 80,000 people. We expect all of them to touch our tools. They don't, for sure. How do we identify those people who haven't and try to get them engaged? What's stopping them from engaging? What are the barriers in place for them to engage? And how do we address those? First, how do we identify them, and then how do we address them? This is a real challenge because we also heavily encourage anonymous concern reporting. So we have some sites that's entirely anonymous concern reporting and others that have sort of a hybrid approach. But obviously we don't know if that person's actually entered a concern or not. They may have entered it anonymously, but there's other ways that we can sort of use to track some of that engagement, at least to get to the majority of people. I don't think we're going to get to everybody if we continue promoting anonymous, which I definitely think we should, but it's something that we're trying to get to, that we want everybody to engage with safety in some way, whatever makes sense for them in their operation. Talk about a little bit about adjacent data sets. Mentioned a little bit of this before from HR, ombuds cases, employee surveys. We've been using the employee surveys quite a bit to see, do they feel like they have a voice to stop work, right? Do they feel like leadership supports them when they do? Compliance issues around investigations and violations. We use Factory Mutual for our insurance, facility insurance. Are we closing out the findings from their audits? Do we have product safety concerns coming up? Quality and EHS are very closely aligned. When you see quality issues from the products that manufacturing plant is making, you're likely to see safety issues, and similarly the other way around as well. They just tend to go hand in hand. So about some of the AI tools we have internally that are looking across our data sets, across data lakes, and able to pull in these different data sets, that's sort of the next step that we're moving towards, to get cross-functional with our data analytics that we really haven't done up until now. When we get into practical applications, be cognizant of time here, but I want to get through some of these. These are the Gen Suite tools. I just want to give you a couple examples just to see that this is part of that data entry set, scoring them to say, whether or not it's a strong response. It's going to also suggest some additional information that might make this a stronger response through the writing help. And then that user can essentially just copy that down into the record. And now we have much stronger description that not only helps us identify risk, but also helps us with whatever analytics that we put on our data after the fact. So this is already driving huge improvements in the quality of our data just in the past year or so that this has been rolled out. And we're seeing trying to get this sort of similar basic kind of helper AI installed wherever possible because it's really powerful. It's pretty straightforward, but it's driving great results. Just going through this video here, see if I can speed this up a little bit. Okay. Safety Oculus, we talked about this a little bit in the cranes and fork truck, computer vision, where we're analyzing the image, collecting the data, and driving actions to closure. This is some examples of a case looking at forklift proximity to users, people near a lift, standing under a load. Don't think I have enough time for this video, so I'm going to skip it, but it's essentially showing how a man down is identified, flagged, an alarm goes off, and notifies people on the site that something has happened, but also records that information into our system. And then we're able to do dashboard reporting on that system. And this really powerful tool within Gen Suite, the PSC Advisor, where it's helping us identify those potentially severe events, where our people maybe did not. And so the tool is built to identify where it thinks a potentially severe event occurred and gives us those additional learnings to go back, not only to learn from the event that took place or almost took place, but also to teach some of our people how to better identify that it was a PSE and not just a low severity event that occurred. And so this is allowing us to better identify risk in our locations and operations. And it's built directly into the Gen Suite tool. So it's right there at the point of work. And we're able to see the type of risk, looking at it across sites, get down to the detailed records that are driving that, and allows us to take action. We have different visualization tools to see the heat maps, to identify what the confidence rating is, that the AI tool is identifying the risk accurately. And then we're providing feedback through the tool to make sure that we're getting good scores on this. How am I with time, Jennifer? Looks like maybe running out here.
Yeah, we are at the bottom of the hour, and while we don't want to lose any of our participants, I can stay on for a little bit longer. I have a couple questions I'd love to ask you, but maybe we should
Sure.
start wrapping it up.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this AI tool, I've kind of already touched on this a little bit around identifying those signals, right, and the frequency that we want to set a trigger. So I won't go into any detail on this, but this is where we're hoping to go, working with our advanced research team and where we'd like to, partner with as many people as we can to help with this project. But I'm open to questions.
Well, I mean, I think you just gave us a master course in analytics for this very, operational mindset. I will tell you that we have online with us actually one of our former speakers who is at Mass General Hospital in operations, and she's been texting me, telling me, "Oh my gosh, this is so much exactly what we're thinking about in terms of our own safety records and our own incident reporting." So, just
Awesome.
shout out to Cecilia.
Awesome.
Um, so one question that I'm going to take, I guess the moderator's right here and say, one question that's been occurring to me throughout your talk is that we're sort of on this cusp now of agents also acting autonomously in terms of identifying in terms of identifying incidents and oftentimes acting on incidents. And I guess, my question for you is how do you think about, where where that line is between just information and action, and what you think. How is GE Vernova going to think about that alignment as you move forward?
Yeah, I mean that's a great one that we've been talking about a lot lately, and a lot of our tools are recommending, making recommendations, guidance notes. They're saying, hey, maybe that's severe, maybe you should take another look at it.
Hmm.
We're purposely not using it as a decision maker. We're using it as a quality control or a coach.
Hmm.
But when we think about this early notification system, we do want it to provide the rationale for why you're getting a notification, and we want it to suggest some actions that you should take with your team. But we really have to maintain the mindset that we are the subject, we are the humans in this, and we're the subject matter experts, and we have to put that filter on to say, wait a second, we know AI can hallucinate. We know it's not always going to be perfect. We always have to validate whatever's coming to us, and we have to be making the decisions. So we are definitely not in a position where, even with that contractor document assessment, I mean, we're auditing that on a regular basis. We're using it as a preliminary rating, but we're still managing those contractors. We're not saying, okay, you're good to go. We're still going to manage them and review everything, and audit the program itself. So it's we're not going to use it for decisions at this point, for sure.
Yeah, I think uh, it's an interesting place where you're sort of thinking about the balance of, what is the human in the loop, and it makes so much sense. Again, I'm hearing from folks that are also similarly working in places where, human safety first is if that's the goal, then there is this element of receiving coaching versus sort of a very automated process that you can kind of just like let run in the background. I think those are two very
Yeah.
different things. And I think
And
that in the larger dialogue, that's a space where some of that nuance is getting lost currently.
Sure.
Um,
And I think, even go back to the Robotics Council, we're brought to that table to come up with, ideas for innovative robotics to get people out of the way. But
mhm,
like, we're happy to be there because we're almost more concerned about the safety caused by the automation, or the safety risks that are being introduced by the robots, and who's looking after that. And so I think with all of this, there's a safety risk being added that
mhm.
we always have to be, we're always reassessing the conditions on the ground to see what's changed, and reassessing, right? So I think that's the human element with all of this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. Um, Again, it's sort of that next level of, well, if you're bringing these in for safety, what are the trade-offs you're also making?
Right.
Um, I'm wondering, well, so here's a follow-up question. I think when you're going to think about, predictive models, or sort of what are your other interventions, right? How often are you thinking about, or I guess, what is the split in terms of when you're thinking about how do we change processes versus how do we change personal behaviors? Um,
Really?
what's your observation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because you could change the processes, and if you don't change the culture, the same thing's going to happen, right?
Mhm,
But being able to identify that there is a cultural issue and that there is a behavioral issue, that always needs to be addressed regardless. And it's often harder to identify. I mean, some of the data points we're looking at, I think, get us there. But you have to be looking at more than just your numbers, right? I mean, you really have to be like living with your data to be reading the descriptions, and understanding the different tags that say, hey, wait a second, this might have been like a Band-Aid first aid case, but this really sounds like it was a cause caused by a lack of leadership, or a lack of care, general care at the site, and we're lucky this wasn't worse than it was. Like,
mhm.
those issues need to be addressed, because process is not going to fix it. um, so I think that's where we, once we draw the line necessarily, but that's where we focus first. But if we see something happen, and obviously, somebody's repeatedly in the line of fire, and we know that risk is present, we're going to try to focus those areas to change those processes for sure. Because you know, from a HOP, human operations performance, optimizing performance, you want to eliminate people from the risk first,
Mhm.
whenever possible. So if it's
Yeah.
not cultural, it's just the nature of the job and the nature of the process, that person is in the spray booth spraying the piece of equipment. Like, do they really need to be in there? Can we just not have a robot do that and pull that person out? That's not really a behavioral issue as much as a risk issue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so to wrap us up, I loved how you laid out the sort of the different interventions that you're thinking of in terms of how you improve safety. So, whether that's wearables, robotics, and I guess to close us out, if you think about, 5 years from now, which of those categories, AI, robotics, wearables, what do you think will have the biggest impact on how GE Vernova is going to be performing in safety?
I think I would put sort of equally on two. One would be, where I left off here with this early warning detection system.
Hmm.
If we can get to that preventative notification, that's going to be hugely effective. I am 100% confident that's where we need to go. But I think in the field, in real time, the wearables around monitoring, perhaps with computer vision, to monitor the work people as they're performing it, both for that person and for leadership to um, help protect that person. I think that's a bigger challenge probably, but I think has much bigger payoff. And that's where we're seeing the most risk is our people in the field outside of our facilities, often beyond our control.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, GE Vernova is one of our newest HDSI corporate members. We are so excited to get to work with you in this space. I think that,
Same, same.
yeah, it is such a rich space, and it brings up so many questions. And obviously, the system that you have currently developed is incredibly sophisticated. And I think where we can add value is thinking very broadly about how we begin to expand your predictive capabilities. So I'm thrilled. Um, okay, wonderful. So I'm going to close this out. I'd like to mention that our next industry seminar will be next month with Reddit. Registration's available on our website, which is datascience.harvard.edu, and through our weekly newsletter. And we hope to see everyone there. So, with that, thanks again. Thanks so much, Alan. Thank you to our very engaged audience. You asked awesome questions. He covered so much of it. And yeah, we hope that everyone will have a good afternoon. We'll see you soon.
Good. Thank you very much.
Take care.